I have traveled a good bit. Being in the witness protection program is a very, very good situation to make you feel secure. I have a couple of questions. Number one, hold up your hand. How many people here have either attended ETSU or are familiar with ETSU over your lifetime? Okay, so half or more of the people here have got that connection. That brings me to another question. Why? W-H-Y. Why? All of us wonder from time to time why Dave Oakes went to the University of Georgia, or why our mayor came back to Kingsport. You know, why? It's a big question. And I'm going to be talking about the railroad history of the area here in a moment, and so I want to ask a few questions about why, and then hopefully when I get through here in an hour and a half or so, you'll have the answer to all those questions. And the first one is, why is ETSU built between two railroads? You know, it's a long, narrow campus. There's a railroad on both sides of it. Why? Why, you folks that have boats, when you go up to Boone Lake, when the water's full, and you're down toward the dam and you want to go up the Watauga River side of the river, why can you take a shortcut through a little narrow canyon there and avoid a 1.5 mile loop in the lake? Why? Strange. Unicoi, Tennessee, big place. Why on earth would Unicoi, Tennessee have the main street in town as Massachusetts Street? I mean, they didn't even know where Massachusetts was. Or in Weber City, why is there a Charleston Street, which parallels the highway through Weber City? Or why is there a railroad crossing on Main Street here in Kingsport? Why? We got all kinds of whys out there. So hopefully I'll answer 4 or 5 of those whys. Tennessee, we live in a really unusual state. We live in an area that's closer here in Kingsport to Toronto, Canada, than it is to Memphis. Anywhere in Tennessee is no more than 90 miles from another state. Tennessee bounds 8 states. Nobody else in the country has that many neighbors. All of us who've been around for very long know that Tennessee's been characterized in a lot of different ways by different political structures. One of them was the 3 states of Tennessee. Remember when you used to come to the state line? Welcome to the 3 states of Tennessee. West Tennessee, Middle Tennessee, East Tennessee. More recently, there's been an effort to kind of bring that together, and Upper East Tennessee still hasn't been included, but we're hopeful that we'll eventually get that. So what's happened over the life of Tennessee from the 1890s to now is Tennessee is an east-west political structure, but a north-south economic structure. The whole structure of Tennessee economically is not east-west, it's north-south. Even the people in Nashville don't recognize that. And I'll give you an example. About 20 years ago, I was in the Tennessee DOT office in Nashville in the rail section of the DOT, and I was talking to this gentleman who was in charge of the railroad segment of the Department of Transportation. And I finally realized he did not know that you can not go from Bristol to Memphis on a railroad and stay in Tennessee. And these are the people who are managing the railroad program in the state of Tennessee, which is a little disconcerting. But just as information, the railroad from Bristol to Memphis goes through Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi to get there. In any event, the railroads came along one by one and really got East Tennessee and Southwest Virginia both on their feet economically. In 1836, the longest railroad in the world was finished from Charleston, South Carolina to Hamburg, South Carolina, which is actually on the other bank of the river, Savannah River from Augusta, Georgia. 136 miles, longest railroad in the world. There was nothing like that in East Tennessee. It wasn't until 1856 that the first railroad came to our border, when the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad was built 200 miles from Lynchburg, Virginia, through Big Lick, which Dave Oaks here knows is now called Roanoke. He was around at the time. And then down the valley, down the Holston River tributary valley to Bristol, a place called Goodson in 1856 when he got there. In 1859, the East Tennessee in Virginia was built 130 miles from Knoxville through Morristown, Greenville, Johnson, which was not even there, to Bristol, and they connected. And that created a railroad system from the East Coast in the Washington, Baltimore, New York area, where you had a continuous railroad all the way down through Chattanooga to Birmingham, to Atlanta, to Mobile, and to New Orleans. There was only one problem. In 1859, the railroads in the north were 4 feet, 8.5 inches in gauge, like this. The railroads in the south were that much wider, 5 feet. So you had to change trains, and you had to change the cargo in the cars to go from the north to the south. In any event, in 1860, carrying the momentum of the railroads that had come to East Tennessee at Bristol forward, the state of Virginia appropriated the money to build the Virginia and Kentucky Railroad, which was going to go from Bristol through Gate City and down eventually to Cumberland Gap and on to Louisville, an effort by Virginia to have east-west commerce. Tennessee hadn't gotten there yet. And that actual railroad was, but the construction of it began in, I don't know, anybody here know where Boozy Creek is? Okay, Boozy Creek is the valley parallel to 11W between here and Bristol. It's one ridge over. The Virginia and Kentucky could not build in Tennessee because it was Virginia money, because it'd been real easy to come down to Reedy Creek Valley where the highway does and then go into Virginia. So they stayed in Virginia. And so the Boozy Creek has got a lot of the Virginia and Kentucky Railroad grade on it. If you know where to look, you can see it all over that area there. And then along about 1861 in April, a conflict arose between those damn Yankees and Southerners. And the work on the Virginia and Kentucky came to a screeching halt. And that continued to be kind of stalemated until after the war, as you know. So that's how we got to the post-Civil War era. We had one major railroad through East Tennessee down to Chattanooga that connected on both ends. After the Civil War, of course, the economy of the South was in pretty poor shape, and there was a period of about 15 years when a lot of ideas were floated, but nothing physically happened of note. And then one little thing happened, and then one really big thing happened. The little thing was a fellow named Arrow Pardee, who Philadelphia, got interested in the iron ore deposits at Cranberry, North Carolina. Most of you probably know where Cranberry is, but it's not very far from Banner Elk and Linville, that area. So he began building a railroad from Johnson City, which by then was called Johnson's Tank because it was a water tank on the railroad. And the city came later after it was a railroad junction. And he built a narrow gauge railroad from Johnson City to Cranberry, North Carolina, in order to haul iron ore down to Johnson City to the Carnegie section of Johnson City where there was a steel mill. That's the roots of the legendary Tweetsie that we hear a lot about. The Tweetsie Trail is a walking trail out of Johnson City and so forth. And then in 1916, the president of Appalachian State got real hot on getting the railroad extended from Cranberry and Linville to Boone. And so in 1917, the narrow gauge railroad, 3 feet wide, was extended all the way to Boone. And I know Pat Shull does a lot of speaking in the area, and I don't know if anybody here can recite verbatim any speech he's made, but when the railroad got to Boone, I can cite the entire speech the mayor of Boone made to welcome the railroad. It said, "I can remember the only way to get here was to be born here." That was it. That little railroad operated until 1940 when we had the great flood of August 1940 that wiped out the Boone end of the railroad, and it was retrenched back to Cranberry, and it struggled on until 1950 and was abandoned at that point. But almost simultaneously with that, a fellow named John T. Wilder. Anybody in the area ever heard of John T. Wilder? General John T. Wilder, that's right. John Wilder was an iron merchant from Greencastle, Pennsylvania, or Illinois was, who was a general in the Union Army. He was involved in the battles at Chattanooga with Sherman and on to the ocean, but he discovered when he was down here in the military the raw material opportunities in the area with iron ore, manganese, steel, or not steel, but limestone, copper down at Copper Hill. So he came back after the war and settled in Roan Mountain. And one of the things he did is he built a hotel on top of Roan Mountain called the Cloudland Inn. The Cloudland Inn was a unique place, built in 1905 or 6, because it was on the state line. And you could drink in North Carolina, but you couldn't drink in Tennessee. So it depended on which side of the aisle you're on, whether you could get a drink or not. Anyway, Wilder realized the benefits of the area here if they could develop transportation. And the big draw over the area was coal out of Southwest Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, and Southern West Virginia. So he started an effort and organized the 3 C's Railroad: Charleston, Cincinnati, and Chicago. There's an effort to build a railroad from Charleston to the Ohio River. And in 1886, that was incorporated, and they did a financial deal with a company in London called Baring Brothers, not to be confused with another Baring Brothers. The first Baring Brothers financed the 3 C's Railroad. And in 1891, we had a worldwide panic. That's the old name for a depression. And Baring Brothers went broke. In 1990, 100 years later, Baring Brothers, a different company, same name, had a fellow in Singapore who got them so far in debt that they went broke. But it's a different company, 2 Baring Brothers. Anyway, when the 3 C's got started, they built over 100 miles of active railroad in South Carolina and North Carolina, all the way up to Marion, North Carolina. And then in Johnson City, they started south down through what was called Irvin, E-R-V-I-N, which the post office you never get straight. And that's how Irwin, instead of Irvin, got its name, is the post office did that. And he built through the Nottatucky River Gorge to Huntdale, North Carolina. And then from Johnson City, the Carnegie section of Johnson City, the Three Cs built the actual grade for the railroad 90 miles to St. Paul, Virginia. And it's all out there. You just got to know what you're looking for. And in 1891, they went broke, and the Three Cs Railroad wound up with 2 or 3 little pieces. Some of it in Kentucky, a little piece in Virginia, pretty good sized piece in North Carolina, big piece in South Carolina. And it just laid there, and everybody was scratching their head about what to do about this. But that, for example, is why you can run your boat through that little canyon in Boone Lake. That's one of the cuts on the railroad. And when the water's full, when you come out of that cut on the downriver side toward the dam, there's about 500 yards of stone wall right beside the lake. It's just that much higher than the top of the water is, which was the railroad grade. And then it would cross the river to the south side of the river. Anybody here know where K Cliff is? K Cliff was Cliff Sanders' country home, about half a mile off the south end of Boone Lake. Well, the driveway into K Cliff is on that railroad grade. When you drive from Kingsport to Johnson City on 23, the old highway, you cross that railroad grade 5 times. That railroad grade came right down basically the river valley, but it was all over the countryside. If you go out to Hemlock Park, the road to Hemlock Park runs right alongside the river, or the lake it is, till you get to Hemlock Park. That's the old railroad grade. Big Elm Road, anybody know where Big Elm Road is? You're going west on the old highway to Knoxville. When you cross the river at Rotherwood, if you immediately turn right, you go up there a mile, and the road becomes part of the old railroad grade for about a mile up there. It's very obvious what it is. Nice, gentle curves, flat as it could be, and about that wide. Weber City, Charleston Street is built on the old Three Cs grade, parallel to the existing railroad there in Weber City. In fact, the railroad that you drive by right there in Weber City is partly on the old Three Cs grade. So anyway, that went down the tubes, and the only other railroad that was going on in those days is between 1887 and 1890, a group of people in Bristol formed the South Atlantic and Ohio Railroad, which had a different mission. Its mission was to connect Bristol with the coal fields at Big Stone Gap in Appalachia and St. Charles. And they actually built that railroad. It went up to Mendota, came down right beside the Carter Fold place in the valley up there just across the road, through Gate City. Everybody here knows where the Hobnob Drive is. I'm sure the railroad is right across the street from the Hobnob Drive-In. That's the South Atlantic and Ohio. Go on down to Boone Yard, which is another mile, and you'll come to the Big Cut Baptist Church on the old road, not the 4-lane, but the 2-lane. The Big Cut Baptist Church was where the Big Cut was made by the original railroad back in 1860, that you never built on, and it was used by the South Atlantic and Ohio Railroad in 1890, and it's still there, right across the street from the church, and it's where the railroad goes from the drainage basin for the North Fork of the Holston River into the Clinch River basin. You're going down to Spears Ferry and then going up the river toward Fort Blackboard and Dungannon, that area. So anyway, that's kind of how we got to what I would call, well, two other things. This will finish what I call phase 2. In 1910, the railroad that ran from Bristol to South Atlantic and Ohio through Great City and so forth was doing a great coal business, but they were having to handle the coal over a 3% grade over Black Mountain into Bristol. A terrible economic expense because it took so much power to get it over that mountain. So they built the Holston Valley Railroad, which went from Moccasin Gap right down the road at Weber City that we already talked about, through Frisco, Churchill, near Rogersville to Bulls Gap. And that became the coal shortcut for the far west coal operations in Virginia into the Carolinas. In 1898, and here's where I have a foot in the phase 2 and the phase 3 situation, a fellow appeared on the scene who made a huge impact then and is still making an impact even today, 100 plus years later. George L. Carter, a young man from Hillsville, Virginia, had gotten involved in land speculation in the Cripple Creek district in Virginia up near Glaylax and that area, and made some money and came down to this area and got interested in coal. So one of the things he did was he started getting mineral rights for coal in Southwest Virginia, not as far west as the people had already done, but further east, like around St. Paul and Coburn, Dant, Clintwood, and then on into Kentucky as well. And in 1898, he managed to gain control of the Virginia Iron, Coal, and Coke Company, which was headquartered in the Appalachian area, and which owned, in the process of assembling this, he bought the South Atlantic and Ohio Railroad, and they renamed it the Virginia and Southwestern Railway, still operating between Bristol and the coal fields at Appalachia and Big Stone Gap. And then in the following year, he bought another company called the Bristol Elizabethton in North Carolina, BE and NC. And they built a railroad to Elizabethton and then up the valleys on the other side of Holston Mountain to Mountain City. And that was built to reach other iron ore deposits like the ones at Cranberry in the area around Beuladine and places of that sort, and to tap the timber business up there. There was huge tracts of virgin timber. So that became part of Virginia and Southwestern as well. Now, one thing that would make Jack very happy is that George L. Carter was a very reticent kind of fellow, like Jack, very quiet, but George L. Carter did all of his business through intermediaries. And he was a very secretive man. He left no records of his own. The only really hard-bound information about George L. Carter are two things. One is just the reputation has been handed down from one person to another, and two are the court cases, because he was sued, and he sued both sides, everybody he could find a full name and address for. So in 1898, he got the VIC&C going, he got the Virginia and Southwestern going, and his vision was to build a railroad across the mountains. In 1900, the board of directors ousted Carter from the business. This is one of the ones he lost. But one of the really neat things about Carter, and this happened over and over again, whenever he got in a fist fight, in effect, a legal fist fight, he always managed to come out with the money. He might not have won the issue, but he always came out with the money. And in that case, he came out with the money from the VIC&C. So within 2 months, not 2 years, but 2 months, when he was ousted from the company that became a large coal company with Philadelphia interests, he started buying up the pieces of the old Three Seas Railroad, the right-of-way, the pieces that actually operated, the ideas, the charters, and over a course of 7 years, he incorporated his business as the South and Western Railway. Now, another Carterism, very secretive. He lived on Solar Street in Bristol, which is right up above the Blackbird Bakery, if you know where that is. House is still there. He chartered the South and Western Railroad to build a railroad from any place on the Atlantic Ocean to any place on the Gulf, the Great Lakes. That's a pretty good charter. You know, you could get to Memphis, or you get to Wilmington, or you could get to Mobile. You could damn near any place with a charter like that. But as a South and Western Railroad, he incorporated 8 different South and Western companies, and he went out and acquired the right-of-way across the mountain from the Elkhorn City, Kentucky, to Spartanburg, South Carolina. And between 1902 and 1905, he built enough railroad to get to Spruce Pine, North Carolina, and then he realized that he couldn't finance this situation. He was dealing with a bank in Baltimore who apparently loaned him all they were willing to loan him. So in a very uncharacteristic way, Carter went to New York, and he found a private banking company called Blair and Company, B-L-A-I-R and Company. It was chaired by a guy named James A. Blair, and apparently it was a real deep pockets operation, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. Anyway, there's a well-known picture of those people who are historians here of about 9 people on horseback with a coal mine in the background, taken in the winter of 1905. And those are the people that Blair and Company sent down here to examine Carter's coal interests in Wise and Russell County in Virginia, and a little bit of Scott, to determine if they were going to spend the money to build the railroad and develop the coal company. Now, at this point, believe it or not, Carter owned 300,000 acres of mineral rights along the Clinch River and north, all the way into Kentucky. It's also, during the period between 1900 and 1905, is when he bought the property that became Kingsport, the land from Rotherwood to Chestnut Ridge. We're on part of it right here. In any event, he went to New York and got these fellows to come down here, and they agreed to finance the project for control of it, obviously. And some of the people, most of whom I'd never heard of, 1 or 2 we all heard of, were involved here. It was James A. Blair was the chairman of the Blair and Company. John B. Dennis was a partner in Blair Company, and John B. Dennis was designated to take control of managing Clinchfield Coal Company, which they called that, the Clinchfield Railroad, which we'll come back to in a minute, and Blair and Company owned control of the Seaboard Airline Railroad. Now, Seaboard Airline's a strange name. It's not local around here, but it ran from Richmond to Tampa, Florida. There were 2 north-south railroads on the East Coast, the Atlantic Coast Line and the Seaboard Airline. And Blair and Company, through a holding company called the Cumberland Corporation, owned a controlling interest in the Seaboard Airline, and they bought Clinchfield Coal Company, and they bought the South and Western Railway. John B. Dennis was the manager of the project. Norman B. Ream was one of the partners involved in this, a very wealthy man of the early 20th century. T. Jefferson Coolidge, a very wealthy coal operator in the Southwest Virginia and West Virginia, and a fellow named Isaac T. Mann, another coal operator, and then 2 other people. One was W.M. Ritter. W.M. Ritter was the leading hardwood lumber producer in the United States. His company eventually became Georgia Pacific, which many of us have heard of. It still exists. And finally, with a very fortunate name, I might say, the other person was a guy named Thomas Fortune Ryan, R-Y-A-N. He was a lot like Carter, except he had bushels full of money. Thomas Fortune Ryan, he was a Virginian, and he like Carter, left almost no records. You go to the library and they can find somebody named Thomas Fortune Ryan, but he might be living in Meridian, Mississippi, or Anchorage, Alaska. It'd be somebody else. Anyway, in the 1917 issue of Forbes magazine was the first time that they ever tried to determine the 50 wealthiest people in the United States. You know, like the Carnegies and the Standard Oil people. Thomas Fortune Ryan was number 17 of the richest people in the United States in 1917. Anyway, these people built the Kingsport Railroad. The Kingsport Railroad was the South and Western, renamed in August of 1908, the Carolina, Kingsport, and Ohio Railway, CC&O. It's far from South and Western, from anywhere here to anywhere there, to the Carolina, North and South Carolina, Kingsport, the coal fields, Ohio, the Ohio River Valley. Between 1905 and 1915, they built 277 miles of railroad, not around the mountains, through the mountains. 4% of the railroad was in tunnels. There were 55 tunnels on the Kingsport Railroad. And they built it to the highest standards, engineering standards that existed in the period of time they were working. And as an example of that, going back to something local, you probably remember when the bridge at Rotherwood was condemned by the highway department. We had to build a new bridge down there about 15 years ago. That was the fourth bridge at that point, from 1900 to when we built that bridge on the highway. Up the river a mile is the Kingsport Railroad Bridge across the same river. They built that in 1908, and they've never done anything, including not even painted. And yet they're handling 3 times the weight of trains now that was there in 1905 when it was designed and built. And that just shows you can do it right the first time, or you can poor boy it and do it over and over and over again. And that happens, you know, in lots and lots of things. The Kingsport Railroad turned out to be the most expensive railroad built end to end at one time in real dollars of any railroad in the United States. There were 4 railroads being built at the same time as Kingsport. There was Kingsport, the Virginian Railroad, which Henry Huddleston Rogers was building out of his own personal pocket. He was a Standard Oil guy. And it ran from Princeton, Virginia to Norfolk and handled coal for steamship and export business. That was the second one. The Kansas City Southern was built by Arthur Stillwell from Kansas City to Port Arthur, Texas. And Jay Gould, one of the robber barons of old, built the Western Pacific from Salt Lake City to San Francisco. But of all 4 of those railroads, the Kingsport, on a basic mile basis, was the most expensive one ever built. Now, come back to ETSU. I mentioned a panic a minute ago in 1907. 1907, there was another panic, and that's the one where J.P. Morgan rescued the United States Treasury. You know, it works the other way now, but in 1907, the government ran out of money, and J.P. Morgan basically financed the government through the situation. But in 1907, the Kingsport was under construction, and it came through a cut on the old Jonesboro Highway near the Veterans Administration. And the original plan was to just go across the valley and get up on a ridge, which is now on the backside of ETSU, and go through another gap and maintain the same grade from Kingsport to Johnson City, which is 0.5%. In other words, 6 inches per 100 inch going up. It's uphill all the way. And then connect with the railroad that already existed at Unicoi. In 1907, with that panic, the financiers decided, well, maybe we ought to cut back a little bit. So after that railroad was already started, and many of you who've been around state probably remember that behind the dormitories, there were a couple of abutments where it looked like it was going to be a bridge over something, but there was just the concrete abutments. And they laid there from 1907 to 1970. And in 1969 and 70, the railroad decided they were going to build that railroad and abandon the one which is on State of Franklin Road, which is the road is on what was the railroad at that time. So they built 6 miles of new railroad around behind East Tennessee State and abandoned the road where the highway is next to the Coliseum and the hotel and so forth. And Johnson City made a really nice access road to the downtown area. And by building the road that they really meant to build in 1907, it reduced the mileage of the railroad 3 miles and maintained a 0.5% grade all the way to Irwin. So that's how East Tennessee State, which is kind of interesting since George L. Carter gave the state the property that East Tennessee State's owned, that the university raised Cain about relocating the railroad behind the university as they have now. And yet, that's where it is now, and everything seems to be working fine. You never know what's going to come up next. In 1922, James A. Blair and Company, decided that they were going to close the company down and retire. They didn't sell it, they didn't merge it with something, they didn't piecemeal it. They decided they were going to close it down. Now, at this point, they own Clinchfield Coal Company, the ones that we know about here. It was much larger business than that, but they owned Clinchfield Coal Company. They owned the Carolina, Clinchfield, and Ohio Railway. They had sold the Seaboard interests by then. And so they went to the Interstate Commerce Commission, our friendly bureaucrats, and said, we want to sell the railroad. And because of the way the railroad was built and the connections it had, there was nobody that could really compete with them because everybody went this way and the Clinchfield went this way. The Clinchfield was a north and south railroad and everything else was east and west. So the ICC refused to let them sell the railroad. Well, these folks knew a lot of stuff. So they went out and they leased the CC&O Railway to the Atlantic Coastline Company, which was one of those north-south railroads over in the Piedmont, and the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, which the Atlantic Coastline controlled by only a third of their stock. Interestingly enough, in this lease, neither one of those two railroads had a physical connection with the Clinchfield. It was between them, but they were not physically connected. So as part of the agreement in the lease, they had to agree to build a connection to the Clinchfield, both of them. So here was the real hooker on this thing. They leased the Carolina, Clinchfield, and Ohio Railway and set up a company, a name, actually a trademark, named the Clinchfield Railroad Company. It was not a corporation. It was not a legal entity. It was just a trademark. And why did it even registered for that? They operated as Clinchfield Railroad. So they leased the railroad for, and they determined it had $50 million of capital stock. So the railroads, the Coastline and L&N agreed that they would pay 3% of the capital stock registered value for 3 years. They'd pay them 4% for 10 years, and then they pay them 5% for the other 986 years in gold. But bear in mind, there's always somebody around that's going to get you. So two things happened. One, the lease went through, the Clinchfield started operating, they continued to make big money until the Depression. 1932, 1933 were the only 2 years that in the entire history of the Clinchfield Railroad and the CC&O that they did not pay all their bills and have a surplus. But guess what? In 1938 was the second biggest hole in the Depression. 1932 was number one. 1938, they climbed out of it somewhat and collapsed into it again. And guess what? These people that are holding this Kingsport Railroad stock are getting 5% on money when you couldn't get anything on anything in 1938 or in 1932. And the only thing that happened is now they had paper 5% instead of gold 5%. Nixon finished that off, but Roosevelt started that. Anyway, a couple of little odds and ends here, and then we'll try to wrap this up. How many of you ever noticed those two locomotives on Lincoln Street that are parked there every day, day in, day out, weekends and all? Anybody here ever hear of Sheriff Incorporated? Okay, in 1938, Eastman started applying pressure to the Kingsport Railroad to allow the Southern Railroad to serve Eastman so that they have competitive service. And the railroad fought it and fought it and fought it for 25 years. And finally, in 1963, the Eastman people said to the Southern Railroad and to the Kingsport, said, unless you allow the Southern Railroad to serve our plant, we're not going to build another blooming thing in Kingsport. And so with that, the Kingsport agreed to allow the Southern Railroad trackage rights, in other words, operate on the Kingsport Railroad from Frisco, which is 5 miles north of Rotherwood, to Eastman. And in those days, the president of the Southern Railroad was a guy named D.W. Brosnan. D.W. Brosnan was the savior of the Southern Railroad. But D.W. Brosnan was one of the most aggravating, intimidating, frustrating people who ever managed a large company. He made George Patton look like a pacifist. I mean, he was, and that's a great story sometimes to hear this kind of stuff he did. Anyway, Brosnan decided that to serve Eastman, he was going to set up an independent company that was union-free to do that. So he did. And a fellow named Sam Sheriff, who was a railroad official in Knoxville, was appointed to be the operator of that little 5-mile railroad. And that was Sam Sheriff, Sheriff Incorporated. That little brick building was his office, and it was a change place for his employees. And so they started operating. And the unions took the Southern to court over and over and over again. It finally wound up that the railroad was forced to hire union employees, and so then they this became the Southern Railroad. And those two locomotives pick up traffic from Eastman every night, and they go to Frisco.
Hey, Kim, we can't hear.
You maybe share. You may be sharing a lot of problems here, Jack. Anyway, I can't get it done. Anyway, most people can hear me anyway.
We'll bring you back again to finish.
Anyway, those locomotives go to Frisco and back every night and handle 40 or 50 cars of Eastman freight each way every night. Who here knows what a Y is on the railroad? W-Y-E. Okay, a Y is the flat version of a railroad turntable where you turn something around. And Main Street in Kingsport has got a Y, down where the old lumber yard used to be, down there where the concrete plant is now. And that Y is where they turned locomotives around between 1909 and 1970, before they built the High Line in Johnson City. Do you feel better now? Jack, are you feel better now?
Oh, I can hear you great.
Okay, all right. So, anyway, that Y is where every coal train going south stopped and a locomotive came over from Irwin, went around the Y, got on the rear of the train, and pushed it to Irwin. So that's what a Y is.
You ran our guests off. Hey, kids, great program.
All right, Jack, you're so upset me now. I'm just not going to talk about Kingsport at all. So I'm going to give you a nice little wrapped up here. So what's the situation now in Kingsport? The Southern Railroad, which operates through Bristol, Knoxville, Roanoke, is one of the two largest railroads in the South, is now the Norfolk Southern, and merged together. And about 10 trains a day operate on the Norfolk Southern to Bristol. And as part of their operating practice, they're not little short trains anymore. Many of them are 11,000 feet long. That's 2+ miles of train. And 3 or 4 of those every day are like that. So it's really nice that Kingsport doesn't have but one grade crossing for long trains. The Clinch field here in the CSX is now part of the Clinch is part of the CSX, and we have about 6 trains a day, but they're far smaller than that because the coal business is essentially gone. Transportation has changed radically, but Tennessee is still a north-south commercial world in an east-west political world.